We're so pleased to have two great speakers with us today to share their insight and perspective on this topic. My name is Jillian Gladstone. I'm a manager here in CDP's disclosure program, and I also lead on North American forest issues. I'll kick off today's discussion by presenting the findings of CDP's 2014 Forest Report. Then Jonas Krohn from TRILLIUM Asset Management will provide an investor's perspective on the need for transparency into companies' environmental actions. Finally, Robert Turkule will share the approach that PepsiCo has taken to sustainable commodity management. Before we get started, I want to quickly mention that all participants on this call will remain muted throughout the presentations. We will leave time for speakers to take questions at the end, but you can submit questions throughout the hour by using the chat box. If you do not see a chat section on your screen, you can find it by moving your cursor to the top of the screen and hovering. A chat box will appear. Please do chat any questions to the host, and all questions will be asked to our speakers anonymously at the end of the discussion. So with that, I'm happy to provide some of the key findings from CDP's 2014 Forest Report to you today. First, just a bit of context. As I said, my name is Jillian Gladstone. I work with many of you on your disclosures to CDP across all of our programmatic areas, and I also lead on forest engagement with North American companies. As many of you know, CDP provides a global system for companies and cities to measure, disclose, manage, and share vital environmental information. CDP now holds the largest collection globally of primary climate change, water, and forest risk commodities information, and CDP works with market forces to put these insights at the heart of strategic business, investment, and policy decisions. Many people will know us for the work we've done through our climate change program. However, we know that we can't tackle climate change without tackling deforestation. Forests are critical for keeping the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, for providing one of the cheapest and most effective ways of removing carbon from the atmosphere, and therefore mitigating climate change. CDP's forest program was first pioneered by the Global Canopy Program, and CDP now has 6 years of corporate data on the key agricultural commodities driving deforestation: timber products, palm oil, cattle products, soy, and biofuels. These commodities feature in the supply chains of countless companies, ending up in food, fuel, and many other everyday products. As demand for these commodities grows, we can expect global agricultural cropland to expand by 42% by 2050. This demand cannot be met without incurring significant business and environmental risk. And while Brazil has made some progress over the last decade in curbing these levels of deforestation, the rates are once more increasing. Worryingly, we're now also seeing increasing deforestation in Southeast Asia. In fact, in 2014, the rate of deforestation in Indonesia is thought to have surpassed that of Brazil, which is historically the country with the highest rates. But we see that 2014 has been the year of corporate commitments to tackle this deforestation. The message that deforestation must be addressed is filtering through to government and policymakers. Some ambitious new commitments were made at the 2014 UN Climate Summit in New York, including a strong pledge by governments and multinational companies to eliminate deforestation from the production of agricultural commodities altogether by 2020. And an unprecedented number of companies have also set strong deforestation targets over the last year. Notably, Wilmar International, a disclosure to CDP's forest program, committed to zero deforestation. This is expected to save emissions of more than 1.5 gigatons of CO2 by 2020, roughly equivalent to the combined annual carbon emissions of Central and South America from energy consumption. However, these commitments are only meaningful if they're acted upon, and CDP's 2014 Forest Report seeks to push the conversation forward to enable companies to act on these policies. This report outlines the current state of play and identifies steps on the journey to implementing such commitments. CDP's global report was released yesterday at the Asia Pacific Rainforest Summit, and it's now available online on our website with a great infographic that details the steps that companies are using to move towards removing deforestation from their supply chains. Our findings draw on 152 responses from some of the largest multinational corporations in the world. And the first takeaway from the report findings is that there is a business imperative for action. We saw a 30% increase this year in the number of investor signatories demanding corporate disclosure through CDP's forest program. This investor interest is clearly justified as we see almost 3/4 of companies recognizing at least one risk to their business from sourcing commodities linked to deforestation. Much of the risk companies identify is reputational. For example, many companies identify potential risk to their brand because of a high-profile NGO campaign. There's a clear investor demand for the information companies are providing. One example of investor action in 2014 is following the lead set by the Government Pension Fund of Norway in 2013, Storebrand, one of Norway's largest life insurance and pensions companies, reported it had divested holdings in 11 palm oil companies earlier this year for failing to meet its sustainability criteria. We'll hear more from Jonas Krohn of TRILLIUM Asset Management later, but in the meantime, I wanted to highlight a quote from Adam Kanzer from one of our investor signatories to the forest request, Domini Social Investments. Adam says, the things we're asking for and hopefully the results that we're obtaining should be the same whether you're an investor that focuses on portfolio risk or an investor that's focused on environmental issues. Business risk and environmental management are really impossible to separate. He goes on to say, when companies disclose problems they're encountering, this gives investors greater confidence that management is facing reality rather than seeking to paint us a pretty picture. I mentioned previously that 2014 was the year of corporate commitments, and we were pleased to see many companies make public deforestation commitments over the past year. Companies that made public commitments included, but were certainly not limited to, those whose logos you see here. But despite all of the commitments made this year, these are only meaningful if they are translated into action. CDP's forest report highlights steps on the journey that CDP believes can lead a company through this process, starting with making a commitment to meaningfully address the issue and ending in leadership. At every stage, we've highlighted company examples to help share best practice, starting with commitments, but then moving through the identification of a risk assessment process, target setting, and implementation through to leadership. Leading companies are using the CDP Forest disclosure as a platform to report on their activity at all stages in this journey. We want to congratulate the leaders in this year's Forest Information Request. The definition of a leader in this space has evolved and will continue to change as increasing numbers of companies innovate and push the boundaries of what is currently thought of as best practice. Furthermore, one company's actions that define it as a leader may be different to another's. That being said, there are a number of common elements that we see in the companies reporting to CDP's forest program that we consider to be the current hallmarks of leadership, and these are highlighted in the report. Yet, while many companies are demonstrating leading behavior, if you're looking at this list with an eye for North American companies, you will be disappointed. Only one North American company made the list of leaders this year, highlighting another key takeaway from the report. North American disclosures are lagging. We're seeing real inconsistencies in corporate action on deforestation. One of those inconsistencies is at a regional disparity in the level and comprehensiveness of disclosures. By and large, North American companies are apace with their global competitors in making deforestation commitments, but many of them are not yet demonstrating progress towards implementation. This year we saw that twice as many European companies disclosed to CDP as North American, And we saw that North American companies identified fewer overall risks and fewer opportunities than their global competitors. We also found inconsistencies when analyzing companies' progress along the journey. Although we know that the commodities covered by CDP's forest program are major drivers of deforestation globally, recognition of the risks, target setting, and implementation in many instances is more advanced on palm oil and timber than on the other commodities. This brings into question whether companies are really proactively addressing the risks associated with deforestation across their commodities, or whether they're reacting to pressure more from recent NGO campaigns. Action on commodity-linked deforestation has to be taken by companies at every stage of the supply chain. However, retailers and manufacturers need to catch up with producers, processors, and traders in progressing along the journey to achieving their commitments. Despite these inconsistencies, opportunities associated with sustainable sourcing, such as increased brand value and securing the best suppliers, are recognized by the majority of respondents. In fact, almost 90% of global respondents identified at least one opportunity, though as I said, we saw less maturity from North American companies in this regard. Interestingly, the companies that reported the most opportunities were also the ones that have been responding to CDP's forest request for multiple years, demonstrating a link between sustained year-on-year disclosure and a stronger ability to identify opportunities in the space. We expect this ability to identify opportunities around sustainable commodity management to be a major area for growth among North American companies in the coming year, and encourage them to use the CDP disclosure platform as a way to communicate those. To leave it in the words of Lucia von Rusner, from another investor signatory to the forest request, Green Century Capital Management, rigorous and reliable disclosure is critical for investors to understand how companies are managing risks, to separate leaders from laggards, and to make informed investment decisions. CDP's forest program is an invaluable tool for facilitating this kind of disclosure, and we use CDP for informing investor engagements with companies. We look forward to welcoming many more companies to the process in 2015 as we strive for action ahead of companies' 2020 target dates. You can see here some expected disclosure timelines. The forest questionnaire will be released around the end of 2014. We will provide individual feedback to companies on their 2014 responses in the beginning of 2015. Then companies receive their investor request in February or March. We'll hold a spring workshop in March or April where we will discuss forest issues and how companies can be disclosing them through CDP. And finally, the forest questionnaire will end. The disclosure deadline will come likely in June. I will update the specific timeline for disclosure to all requested companies over the coming weeks and months. In the meantime, don't hesitate to be in touch with me to discuss how your company can begin disclosing and how to continue down this journey by using the CDP disclosure platform. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jonas Krohn, who's a Senior Vice President at TRILLIUM Asset Management, to provide us the investor perspective on disclosure through CDP.
Well, hello, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I just want to take a few minutes here just to give you a little context of who TRILLIUM is and our perspective as an investor, just so you understand sort of the following comments and where they're coming from and the import that they have. Probably the most important thing to say about TRILLIUM is that we integrate environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment process. So we manage about $1.7 billion in assets, and we do that with an SRI lens. Some people call that sustainable and responsible investment. Some people call it socially responsible investment. But essentially what we do is negative screening. So we will be looking at companies from an environmental, social, and governance factor and incorporating that into the buy, the sell, the hold decisions that we're making, and be screening out certain companies based either on the kind of business that they are engaged in or whether they represent a real laggard on a particular environmental or social issue that we feel is particularly material to that sector. But it's more than negative screening. There's also positive screening that we engage in. So our research staff, our portfolio managers are also looking for the companies that are leaders in particular areas in their sector that are material to their performance from an environmental, social, and financial perspective. So there's that negative screening piece, there's the positive screening piece. And then there's what I'm responsible for, and I'm the Director of Shareholder Advocacy at TRILLIUM, which is engaging the companies that we own, that we are shareholders in, on their environmental and social performance and their impact. We take our ownership stake in companies very seriously, and as a responsibility, we are an investment advisor registered with the SEC, and so we have fiduciary obligations to our clients to really encourage the companies that we hold to improve their environmental and social performance. And so we do that in a variety of ways, through dialogues and communicating with companies in forums like this, but also through shareholder proposals, white papers, and action through multi-stakeholder engagements. And climate change is an important piece of what we do. It's probably the most important piece of our advocacy work right now, and we look at companies, the energy producers, energy consumers, but in this area, for food companies and consumer product companies, we do spend a fair amount of time engaging companies that are going to be having an impact on climate change through their agricultural supply chains and causing deforestation, as well as those companies that are also going to be feeling the impact of climate change on their supply chains. Probably the last thing I should just mention here, as I said, we are SEC regulated, so that, and I always hate to do this, but I do need to do it in our disclosure. I'm not going to read through this, but essentially, please don't take anything that I say as investment advice, and nothing that I say here should be construed as a research report as well. Those are sort of the two most important parts of that disclosure. The next slide, please. So just real briefly, just want to touch on a couple points that were made earlier, but to drill down in this item a little bit, how investors are using this data and these scores. CDP information can be a very good proxy for good corporate governance practices. Similarly, they can provide some insight into climate change and supply chain management. Excuse me. And for firms, it's also an important source of information for making investment decisions and getting new ideas for companies to invest in, part of that buy, sell, hold process that I was talking about earlier. Creating financial products, there's a great deal of demand right now for low carbon indexes. Some of that has been fostered by the divestment movement, but also by general awareness that climate change is an important, if not one of the most defining investment themes that is part of the marketplace right now. So this information is going to producing those financial products. And similarly, climate risk assessment for portfolios. I think, as was sort of referred to earlier by my colleague Lucio Van Reusner at Green Century, it's an important piece of engagement and active shareholders. Right now, the principles of responsible investment represent trillions of dollars of assets, in addition to the CDP's engagement process with companies, where we really take the opportunity as owners to discuss deforestation, but other climate change issues. And then also, as was discussed, reputational risks are very real, particularly for consumer and customer-facing companies. That top-line risk is something that we watch very closely. But I think to sort of boil this down, what is really important is that investors want to understand what management understands. Does management understand their supply chain? Does management understand the risks that they face related to deforestation? And do they understand the risks that they are creating? So, and this is particularly true whenever we're talking about agriculture. It's both that double-edged sword, the impact that we have on climate change as well as the impact that climate change has on supply chains. And like was discussed earlier, about 74% of companies are recognizing that at least one material business risk is associated with a key commodity that's driving deforestation. The next slide, please. Another piece that I really do want to emphasize that hasn't been covered yet, and is really as important as looking company by company at these issues, is to remember that the vast majority of investors are widely diversified. And by that, sometimes that's called universal owners, that we're diversified across sectors, across markets, across countries. And it's very unusual for a company or for an investor to be holding just a very small set of companies. And the result of this is, and being widely diversified is good for investment purposes, but it means that investors really cannot hide from the negative economic consequences of climate change. The externalities, those negative externalities caused by deforestation, are going to come to rest somewhere in the portfolio. And those costs have been talked about for years, going back to the Stern report about 10 years ago or so at this point. But recently, the Risky Business Report has put some numbers to that, and this was a report that was put together by Hank Paulson and other respected business and financial leaders, including Greg Page, actually, who's the chairman of Cargill, putting numbers to the amount of economic consequences to climate change. Some of the numbers that they put were $35 billion a year in damage to coastal property and infrastructure, which is critical, and additional, $12 billion a year in energy costs. And recently as well, the President's report on the cost of delaying action on climate change talked about how warming to 3 degrees Celsius, so that's moving a degree above what consensus believes we need to be, keeping temperature increases to 2 degrees or below, will result in another $150 billion in costs in the United States alone. And if it goes up another degree to 4 degrees Celsius, that'll be another additional $200 billion. All of that is a drag on economic growth and value creation, and therefore is a drag on our portfolios. And that's why forest protection and deforestation is really a critical issue for us to be looking at, because it can have the highest impact on climate change mitigation. And just to sort of emphasize this one last time, one company externalizing its costs, for example, not paying for the value that it would be destroying through deforestation, means that those costs are going to land somewhere else in the economy, and that short-term benefit to one company is going to really, it's going to levy costs somewhere else in the company. And these costs are likely to land on the wider economy so that they affect negatively the context in which all these companies are going to be doing business, and therefore is going to have an impact on our portfolios. Next slide, please. And I also just want to also sort of point out the list of companies that Jillian mentioned earlier that had been making commitments over the last year regarding zero deforestation policies. And I think what I want to emphasize here is that for folks on the phone, companies on the phone that haven't taken this step yet, you have an enormous set of resources available to you from these companies. These companies may be leading, but you have the advantage of their leadership in setting your own targets, implementation, guidelines, waypoints along the way, and eventually providing leadership yourselves. So I think you should take to heart inspiration from these companies. I know as investors, we have worked closely with many of these companies on developing these policies, and I guess that would get me to the last slide, which is that you should feel free to contact me to discuss any of these issues further. But thank you very much for your time and the opportunity to share our perspective.
Thank you so much, Jonas. That was really helpful, and we appreciate the insight. if you do have questions for Jonas based on anything he just told us and the insight he's provided here, please do feel free to chat them to the host, and we will pose them to him at the end of the hour. Before that, though, we are going to move on to Robert Turkule, who's joining us from PepsiCo, and will tell us a bit about PepsiCo's journey in addressing sustainable commodity management.
Jillian, and Jillian, thank you very much, and Jonas, really appreciate your presentation there. I think a lot of good things, and certainly brings that very strong investor perspective. Have the opportunity here to talk about PepsiCo, so I think I will certainly take that. For those of you who aren't familiar with PepsiCo, if you go to the next slide, I'll give you the quick commercial. Of course, we are Pepsi, Frito-Lay, Quaker, Tropicana, and Gatorade. On the next slide, you'll see the scope of our operations and really who we are, made up of more than 250,000 employees. We operate in more than 200 countries, and we're proud of our $22 billion brands and certainly the other brands that we have. We end up touching, I think we're close to the billion touch points every day globally, and so which makes us a large organization with a very diverse supply chain. But all that is wrapped up in the next slide in our Performance with Purpose platform. This is how we articulate our sustainability goals and programs and how we approach the topic. I won't get into each one of these because we are going to focus certainly today on what we're doing around forest and forest disclosure, but I would encourage all of you who have not seen it or were not present at the recent BSR conference last week. Our chairman and CEO gave a fantastic keynote speech where she outlined a lot of our thoughts on performance with purpose and where we think things are going, certainly focusing on the long term, to Jonas's point, versus the short term, and how we can find that appropriate balance for business. So for PepsiCo, we get the question quite a bit as to why we would care about deforestation and forests. And I think it's important to note, as we do on the next slide, that sustainability for PepsiCo begins at the farm level. We have a wide and diverse agro supply chain that really spans across all of the operating areas where we find our facilities and where we distribute our products. A lot of our farmers are local farmers that we work with and contract directly. As an example, in India, we work with more than 30,000 direct potato growers, and those are direct contracts with PepsiCo in an effort to ensure that we're working with local farmers, smallhold farmers, and helping to grow local capacity. We have a wide range of commodities and crops that we use. For example, we use sunflower oil in many of our markets, but we also use palm oil. And we have other crops that are grown in regions that may have experienced deforestation in the past or could be at risk for deforestation. And as part of that, we stepped back and took a look at where are we in terms of our policies and programs and what's important to us as PepsiCo. And one of the things, as we point out in the next slide, is that water is a huge issue for PepsiCo, not just in our facilities, but for our partner farmers. And this is just one metric that we kind of stepped back and took a look at and realized that the amount of water that goes into growing 1,000 kilograms of potatoes so we could make the crisps from them is significantly more than what we use to process them. Which, of course, begs the question of how do you help to protect that resource and commodity. And so as you'll see in the next slide, one of the things that we have relied on, not just with the forest footprint disclosure as it was back in 2008, 2009 when it first got started, and then was taken over, of course, by the CDP in 2013. But where does PepsiCo stand on this from a policy perspective? And I highlighted this specific portion of our policy to show that not only do we recognize that forests are important, but that they play a key role in our supply chain. And one of those key roles is enhancing watersheds. And this, I think, is one of the major aspects of being able to go through the forest disclosure to perform that risk analysis, to map your supply chain and understand it, is it helps to bring out these types of learnings. It helps you to realize and look at those opportunities and risks through a different lens. What it also does, and for us, for PepsiCo, it helps you to focus on where some of those biggest opportunity areas are. And you won't see on this slide, but I just wanted to talk briefly about our commitments around palm oil and how we have addressed that particular challenge. You'll find this all on our website. Would encourage everybody to go and see that, where we've made our commitments to be 100% RSPO by 2015, and we're in the process right now of implementing, if you will, an RSPO plus policy and program, where we are working with our partners in our palm oil supply chain to go above and beyond and to leverage what we call our sustainable farming initiative, as well as our forestry stewardship policy and our land policy and human rights elements, to ensure that our commodity partners are operating not only in accordance with the RSPO, but also with PepsiCo policies. But all of this really kind of focuses in on that initial step of doing the analysis and doing the reporting. And for those of you who are considering or who aren't sure about the reporting, I would really encourage you in the fact that this has helped PepsiCo get to where we are today. If you're looking for the groups that are trying to help put some of these policies and programs into action, to Jillian's point earlier, which I think is a really key point, would really encourage you all to take a look at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the WBCSD, and their Forest Solutions Group. If you're already a member of the WBCSD and you're thinking that the Forest Solutions Group is mainly just for the folks that are, of course, working in timber and direct forest-based products, would encourage you to take another look at it, because certainly from a PepsiCo perspective, forests have a big impact to what we do and how we operate. So hopefully that gives some perspective from a PepsiCo standpoint of not only how we're addressing forests and how we perceive them, but as well the policies, programs, and actions that we've taken to put in place and really take this forward. And so I think I just had the thank you slide after that, and well, of course, the scale up slide, and that really is the WBCSD and finding those other partners to scale up and to take this forward. And so then with that, we'll just transition out and maybe into the Q&A section. Jillian, I think, is next.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. That was really helpful. So that's absolutely right. We're going to move into the Q&A section. I invite our participants to chat questions to our speakers, and we will pose them now. While we're waiting for a few other chats or questions to come in, Jodis, someone did write in asking while you were speaking if in your engagement with companies you've seen a similar discrepancy between North American and European companies' levels of understanding and commitment to action on deforestation, similar to the trend that we saw.
I think the short answer to that is yes. We are actually tend to be more U.S. focused. U.S. public equities are our particular specialty. That being said, understanding where the companies that we are engaged with, particularly as the marketplace is becoming more and more global, we do need to understand that in the context of their competition. And to give one example, we've done a fair amount of work in the area of coffee, which is not one of the commodities that is sort of a larger risk, but it does, I think, give an insight into how U.S. companies, large companies when it comes to coffee, are at an earlier stage of the process than their international counterparts, and are sort of more slowly getting up to speed. The one thing I guess I would say that I might add in here, though, is that the last 6 to 9 months has been dramatic, I think, in the United States in terms of the number of companies taking that step that first step of making the commitments. I think we're starting to see a level of activity in the last few months that is a watershed, I think it's fair to say, for the consumer-facing companies. I think part of that is the growing, the changes that are occurring in the sector, where there is more and more pressure from less and less consumer demand on the middle of the aisle in the grocery stores, and there's a lot more interest and attention on the perimeter of the grocery store, which is to say that consumers are demanding a significantly higher level of transparency about where their food comes from and what the story is around the production of their food, and whether it is directly because it's soy or palm or cattle, or if it's sort of secondary and tertiary impacts related to deforestation. That demand is very real, and I think we're starting to see in the United States, at any rate, more and more realization that companies need to respond to that consumer demand.
That's great, Jonas. And Robert, that segues nicely to a couple of questions that we've had for you around kind of what are the challenges that you're seeing in that scaling up that you talked about, that all-important kind of process towards implementation. And I wonder specifically if you find suppliers in different regions have different levels of awareness about sustainable commodities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. Some of the challenges that we have seen have been really focused around that non-holistic approach. I think to Jonas's point, and that we get overly focused in on single commodities. So while palm oil certainly is important and something that we should be focusing on, from a PepsiCo perspective, it's a very minor and small spin that we have. We do have goals and programs to address it, and we are actively putting them in place. But it is important that you address it on that, across your entire supply chain. So that's a challenge, that you're being asked to overly focus on maybe what might be small impacts for your individual business. I would encourage everybody to kind of take a strategic, applicable, implementable, and long-term look at things when they're being asked to look at their supply chain, and identify what your top commodities are as they relate to and where they may be grown. And specifically around regions, yes, regional approach is critical and also challenging. So the work that we'll be doing in Mexico, for example, in the palm oil supply chain there, versus the work we'll be doing on coconut water in the Philippines will look quite a bit different. We will take that plus approach, so if you will, in terms of the RSPO and then adding additional questions to it, or leveraging another standard for the coconut water. And that's part of the challenge then, is ensuring you have the consistency, but ensuring that there's buy-in from the local growers. But then also ensuring that you're meeting all of your needs and standards. So you can go in and say, we want to do this RSPO audit, but it may not align with all of your programs and policies, so you have to add to it. And being able to ensure that you have the right agreements in place and the right partnerships in place so the value to your supplier is seen to go and do that extra, that plus, I think is definitely a hurdle that we've been working on to overcome. But happy to say we have very strong partners in this space and folks that are willing to work with us directly.
And to that point, Robert, someone asked if PepsiCo has any specific examples of collaboration either with their peers or with other sectors who are sourcing similar products from these specific areas or even specific farmers.
Yeah, so I think RSPO is certainly one of the best examples of that collaboration of trying to move an entire supply chain. If you look at the roundtable for sustainable soy, if you look at Bonsucro and these other initiatives that have started, I think are really good. But if you also step back and look at some of the regional specific things, I think you have to reach into like the Consumer Goods Forum, the WBCSD, BSR, all have groups that have been formed to address either a regional or even country level specific challenge, or to approach it from a commodity standpoint.
Great. One more question for you, Robert, and then we'll shift gears, but there's a lot of interest in how you're dealing with this. Can you speak more to how you overcome reluctance from suppliers and growers to these commitments?
Sure. So one of the things that has been very helpful is for us to have this global movement, I think that Jonas certainly talked about and pointed to, and Jillian, you brought up in one of the first slides of the overall changes that are occurring, have been very helpful in us in working with our suppliers to ensure that we can get alignment with them and the folks that they're also supplying to other than PepsiCo to show that we have this consolidated, if you will, collaboration and partnership. One of the last things that farmers and suppliers want to do is have to respond to 40 different requests for information. And if we're able to come together and show them that we're working with other like-minded organizations or that our policies align with other policies that have been stated that they may also be supplying to, it makes them much more willing to enter into our programs, because then they can leverage them instead of having to respond to, you know, yet another questionnaire from another customer.
Great. A few people have asked if the recording of this webinar will be made available, and I just want to let them know, yes, I will circulate this after the session today, along with a link to our infographic online and our report. Another question, someone asks if all of the companies who are making zero deforestation commitments include all commodities in their commitments. And I can say no. Many of the companies that are making commitments around maybe one or two commodities. And Jonas, this leads into a question that's come up for you. Do you see investor engagement going beyond a current focus on palm? And you know, as we saw, a lot of companies are thinking both about palm and timber, maybe in a more proactive way than they are thinking about some of the other commodities.
Sure. So that's a good question, and I guess a couple different points that I'd make there. One is, you know, we're seeing some companies sort of take the opportunity and the attention around palm oil to be a springboard to saying, okay, what are our top 10, say, commodities, either from a volume point of view or from a that they're critical to the supply chain or are particularly revenue important for the company, and lay out those 5 or those 10 commodities and develop a set of sustainability strategies around each one. One example of that would be General Mills. They've got their 10 that they've identified, and they've got and in their sustainability reporting, they talk about where they are with each one of those 10, which organizations they're working with, how far along they are in terms of goal setting, what milestones along the way, and then completion. Another sort of way that this has begun to develop is that companies are starting to now, particularly food companies, but consumer goods more broadly, say, well, what are my Scope 3 emissions, particularly around the agricultural supply chain, and understanding the greenhouse gas emissions that, beginning to try to understand the greenhouse gas emissions that are attributable to their purchases, their demand for various commodities. And that's a piece of work that I think is still at its beginning stages. I think probably everybody on the phone can think of a million reasons why that's a very complex question to engage with, but it's one that a number of companies are starting to do, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle for the reasons I was talking about earlier, which is that agriculture has such an important impact on climate change, the greenhouse gases that are emitted through the agricultural processes, but at the same time, agriculture is on the front lines of being impacted by climate change.
Great, that's really helpful. One company has asked how, if they are sort of just starting out on this journey, how does a company like them approach this when they feel the responsibility for implementation really lies in their supply chain, with their suppliers, and so is a bit out of their hands? And I'm happy to mention that we did see companies closer to the commodities, such as producers and traders, are really outperforming the manufacturers and retailers in terms of their level of disclosure. And I think this is, because they're closer to the commodities, so they're likely seeing more operational risks as well as reputational ones. So we're not really seeing these risks being reported, specifically operational risks, in high levels through the rest of the supply chain. But if they exist, then we at CDP see them as something that the stakeholders throughout the supply chain should be undertaking those risk assessments to understand what the potential risks are down the supply chain, and that requires companies across the supply chain to communicate and work together on all of these risks. One tool that we have in place at CDP, and actually are rolling out this year, is using our supply chain engagement program and applying it to forest disclosures coming this next disclosure cycle in 2015. So for those who aren't familiar with the program, CDP provides a platform for not only investors to request data from companies, but from companies to request data from their suppliers. So we, on behalf of member companies to this program, put out a request for their suppliers to respond to the forest questionnaire so that customers can start to get an understanding of what's happening in their supply chain, gather that data, understand the risks so they know, where their attention is required. But and I should say that's a pilot program that we're rolling out next year. It will be developed over the coming years and hopefully scale up to the maturity of our climate and water programs that run along similar lines. If you're interested in that, definitely follow up with me. I'd love to tell you more about that and get your participation as we build out that pilot. But I would also put that question both to Robert and Jonas. What do you see as kind of a first step for a company who's only just starting to think about this, and especially for those who see most of the risk really down their supply chain? I know, Jonas, you talked about using commitments that others have made as, you know, a roadmap. But can you talk a little more specifically about what you see the first step being for them, and maybe even what some of the metrics might be that you're looking at that they might want to focus on?
Sure. So, you know, I think for a number of companies, it's identifying, you know, sort of those key commodities. And then I think I've seen sort of a couple different ways of going at it. One way is to sort of start with what is relatively small and manageable and you can get your hands on, and where you've got that sort of closer direct relationship through the supply chain. And to have that be a starting point where you can then say, all right, in this particular, you know, with this particular part of my supply chain, we're going to set a target of, you know, reducing the use of agricultural chemicals, say, by 20%, you know, on a 2005 baseline in the next 5 years, and then take that sort of nugget of learning and then expand it beyond. At the same time, you know, we've talked about some of these larger organizations like Bon Sucre and obviously the RSPO, where there is, you know, you can go and work with a larger group of companies, but also NGOs, civil society organizations, environmental groups, to sort of learn from and follow that path that has already sort of been tread for you. And then I guess, you know, there's also, you know, organizations out there that basically come in as consultants, you know, and will work with a company on basically, you know, going through that basic risk assessment and just trying to find that heat map of where the risk is in the supply chain as that first step to identify where your energy is best put in developing the strategy. These things tend to start off small, but then, you know, build in a very direct way into a comprehensive strategy.
Great. Robert, anything to add in that regard in terms of first steps or how you approach risk management for your supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just building on what Jonas said, identifying your top commodities is really quite critical. You can approach it from several different aspects, but I would, you know, of course, advocate that you take a look at where you can have the biggest impact. So we did this with our top 4 commodities, and that's where we were focusing our initial efforts with the Sustainable Farming Initiative. I would also encourage you to take that risk filter and apply it, not just from a deforestation standpoint, but also from a social impact standpoint. Of course, we all know that there are a lot of social impacts that come along with deforestation. And being able to understand that and realize it is quite important. And then also where you can realistically have an impact and bring about change. So as you look at, you know, programs to put in place and commodities to focus on, ensuring that you're applying a filter that is practical, applicable, implementable, and long-term, I think is really quite critical. We're all going to get pressure from various different entities in different directions, but ensuring that you're doing it where you can have the biggest impact, where it makes the most sense from a risk standpoint, and programs that are practical, applicable, and implementable and long-term will ensure success going forward.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it here as we have hit the top of the hour, but I do want to thank our speakers, Jonas Krohn and Robert Terkuil, for the great insight and really valuable perspective you shared. Just based on the number of questions coming in, I know that a lot of companies who are on the line are finding it really useful to hear from you. So I want to thank you so much for your time, and also want to thank the sponsors whose logos you see here on this page for their support of our 2014 report. And thank you all for joining the webinar today. Please do get in touch with me if you have any questions, things we didn't get a chance to cover during this session, or questions about next year's disclosure cycle. I look forward to speaking to you again soon, and hope you are in touch throughout the coming year as we help to support you in putting those commitments into action. Thank you so much.